Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Nathan Beckord. He's the founder and CEO at Foundersuite. Nathan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Love being back here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on the show. I was looking, it's been 5 years since you were last on the show. So obviously lots have changed probably in both of our lives. But maybe before we get into Foundersuite, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
You bet. I grew up in a little tiny town in the Rocky Mountain National Park area called Estes Park, Colorado. And then
Nice.
we moved down to Then we moved to Saudi Arabia for a year,
Wow.
on a lark. My
How
dad
old were
got a
you?
job, like maybe 11, something like that, somewhere around
Interesting.
that time frame. Old enough where it was a very traumatic move from the mountains of
Sure.
Colorado to sand dunes of Saudi Arabia, but it was also obviously looking back now, I'm like, wow, that was really cool and different and neat. At the time, I'm like
Sure.
terrified by that. But then spent most of the formative teen years, I guess you could say, in Boulder, Colorado. So that's kind of my hometown.
Very cool. So you went to university. What did you take and why?
So yeah, went out from Boulder. Didn't want to stay in Boulder. Boulder has a great University of Colorado, but spent all my high school years going to the college parties and kind of been there, done that. So decided to head out west, young man, go to California. And my dad and I rented I forget what it was, like a Mustang convertible or some ridiculous car, and drove from San Diego all the way up to Oregon, looking at colleges like all along the West Coast, which
Wow.
was kind of fun. Ended up at Santa Clara University, which ended up kind of coincidentally being at the heart of Silicon Valley, and that was sort of the gateway into tech. But I studied finance and German, and then got an MBA at University of Texas in Austin.
Okay, so what made you want to go into finance and take German?
Yeah, good question. Finance was interesting. Like I'm still fascinated. I mean, even what we're doing at Foundersuite is, the facilitating the flow of capital into the best returns, right? Into the best
Sure.
companies. And that's what, I spent a little time doing investment banking, which is helping companies raise capital, helping companies access public markets, which is, I just love this sort of concept that capital will find its way to the best and highest uses. I think that's a really cool concept. And so that was so appealing about that. And that's why I studied that. And it's exciting too, right? You're dealing with money and all that. It's pretty cool.
Interesting. And then what made you want to get your MBA?
I feel like it's not even as relevant. I don't want to say relevant, but not as much of a clear path. Like back when I was in college, if you wanted to be in finance, it was a pretty clear path. You would get your undergraduate degree, go work, usually in investment banking or doing something like that for a couple years, and then you would automatically go back and get an MBA. It was kind of like a given. Nowadays, I don't think it's quite so much. But MBA is also kind of a fun time to like take a step off the work rat race treadmill and just kind of learn some new stuff. A lot of people use it to like pivot their careers, right? I wasn't quite doing that so much, but taking a break from work and spending a few years learning, studying. I'd love to go back to college. I think when I retire, I'm going to just start taking college classes, like,
That's
nonstop.
awesome.
Yeah, I think it'd be fun. Um, And MBA is pretty good for helping build out a network, right? I mean, if you think about like career paths, so much of it is not just who you know, or not just what you know, but who you know. And I
Totally.
think a program like MBAs, I mean, you can build that network other ways too, being part of online communities, being, working at Facebook or Google, et cetera, et cetera. But MBA is a pretty clear way to help build out your network. So, and that was pretty good for me.
Sure. So walk us through your career, maybe some highlights along the way until coming up with the idea for Foundersuite, and then we'll dive into that.
Yeah. So, although I started down this path of being an investment banker, I had an entrepreneurial bug even from forever, I think. I think you're kind of like born with an entrepreneurial bug.
Sure. No, I
Or like,
agree.
yeah. And but I just didn't have any good ideas. So actually when I was at UT getting the MBA, I tried to start a business called Trial Logic, and it was a clinical trial software business. We couple guys and I got together and we licensed some technology out of the university um, MD Anderson Cancer Center. They were using this technology to manage their clinical trial data, and they were looking to license it. And we, spent months negotiating a deal to get this software. But really, I had no real interest in clinical trials. It's something way over my head, and didn't just have a passion for it. So, you know, that failed. Moved back out to Silicon Valley after grad school. I had missed all the on-campus recruiting, so I didn't have a cushy consulting or finance job after getting the MBA. So I just came back out to California and started helping startups raise capital because it's what I knew how to do. Um, all the while thinking, all right, I've got to come up with like, what's my next startup idea? There's got to be something out there and I was keeping a journal, like writing down startup ideas. Nothing was really popping that I wanted to devote my life to. And then one
Right.
day, after helping companies raise capital for several years, just had this idea of like, why don't I build software for this process? It was around the time, if you remember, when Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz
Yep.
came out with that phrase, software is eating the world, meaning like
Yeah,
every
I
industry.
remember that.
Yeah, it was pretty epiphanal, if that's a word.
Yeah, no, fair.
um, yeah. And you saw this happening, right, with tax, right? You saw like TurboTax and Quicken and all these other, coming into tax and legal. There were a bunch of different software things going into the legal world. And like, why isn't this happening in the fundraising world? And so that's what the original idea for Foundersuite came from.
Very cool. So, was there like a defining moment though that made you say like, okay, I need to really build this? Because it's one thing to say like, I should maybe turn this into software, but it's a lot harder to actually commit and actually build it. And you've been doing it for a number of years now.
Yeah. So, we were doing when I had the consulting business helping start Fizz Capital. It's called Venture Archetypes, and we would get a startup on board. We would come in, build them a financial model. We would spend some time researching investors, building a target list, and we'd load it all up into a nice fancy Excel spreadsheet. And um, and then we give them the spreadsheet of investors, and they would use it to track all the conversations, right? But
Okay.
there were flaws in that. Like that spreadsheet works pretty well for about a week or two, and then it gets really, really messy. And so that was the original genesis idea. Like we could turn this into software. We could start on a pretty low level, super simple way, right? It wasn't like if you said, Nathan, you've got to come up and build a NFT marketplace online. I wouldn't know even where to start. But this was
Right.
very achievable, very approachable. I knew what categories this should manage, right? Contact information for the investors. It should manage where you're at with each investor. It should, kind of track all this. It was very approachable and achievable. And so I cobbled together, I don't know, 50 grand or something like that. And got some Polish engineers to build kind of a first MVP of this. So that's the beauty of it. If it's something you already know pretty well and you've lived in the customer's shoes and in the customer taken the customer journey, you can kind of ease into it versus like launching this huge thing from scratch.
No, I think that's actually really good advice. So I'm curious, how has it evolved from that first version to what it is today, like 7 years later?
Well, so I left out a little part of that. We actually thought that maybe doing just software for tracking investors was maybe a little too narrow. So came up with this idea for Foundersuite, which was broader. The original vision was broader a little bit, where it was going to be a whole bunch of different tools, software tools for founders, everything from idea generation validation to fundraising tools to like marketing and PR tools, kind of had this whole suite of things. And we actually built that to start with. And so I used that 50 grand to like build these MVPs of all these different products and realized, hey, what are people actually having trouble with? It's raising capital. What do I actually know best? It's raising capital. And so after after we raised the money, I killed off all the other tools and focused in on the fundraising thing. And then so we launched this investor CRM as our first product. And this is like over 5 years now, 5, 6 years now. Launched the investor CRM, killed off everything else. And then since then, and since you and I last spoke a few years ago, we've just been adding like one or two new products a year, all staying focused on the fundraising. So we added a database of investors, and we're up to about 200,000 investors in
Wow.
this, everything from angels to VCs to private equity, family offices, fund of funds. We added an investor update tool for doing like your ongoing communications, your monthly or quarterly update to investors. We added a pitch deck hosting tool. So if you use DocSend or Google Slides, it's kind of like that. Upload your PowerPoint, you can track who's viewing it.
That's
We
cool.
added, yeah, that was cool. We added a mobile app. We added an email tool for doing like, email blasts that look personalized. We added, most recently, we added a data room. So once you kind of get further along the fundraising process with investors, you want to start sharing all your confidential information, your product roadmaps and intellectual property. So that's where a data room really comes in. So yeah, we've just been kind of expanding it um, ever since those early days of an investor CRM to replace the spreadsheet and just adding more tools. And these tools kind of fit along the continuum of what happens during a fundraise, right? The database is what you would use to start to build that target list. CRM is what you load all those investors targets into. Pitch deck hosting, email tools, investor updates to kind of run the outreach to investors, data room to do the due diligence, so on and so forth. And then just one extra little layer I'll add on that. We've been selling just to startups, but we also have a version now that we've branched off into that's for investment bankers and VCs, anyone who's working with multiple companies, some accelerators using this, anyone who's working with multiple companies, we have a version of the product for them too. So that's how it's evolved.
Interesting. And then what's the startup docs? Because those looked really cool to me too.
Oh yeah, I forgot all about those. Those are a collection of, frankly, a lot of them are back to the consulting days or harken back to the consulting days. It's a collection of pitch decks, term sheets, cap tables. These are spreadsheets. These are PowerPoints. These are PDFs that are all like downloadable consumables. For example, there's some spreadsheets. Like one of them is a VC dilution scenario analyzer. So you can see if you start with, you and your co-founder, maybe you each own 50% of the business today, but you raise 2 or 3 rounds. What does your ownership of the business look like after a couple rounds, right? So there's just some interesting kind of fundamental like documents and templates in there, partnership agreements, NDAs, things like that.
No, very cool. Yeah, I thought like that's super useful because I think when you need to raise money, especially if it's your first time and you've never done it before, trying to find good versions of those documents or even which documents you need is a daunting task.
Yep. Oh, and there's tons of stuff out there, right, on the web. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
million things out there, but you're right. It's finding the good stuff, and like we try and make it fairly curated. Like we have a couple different term sheet templates in there. And then I think we have was written by a law firm. There's like an explanation of terms document. So it's one thing to just have a term sheet that you would use with investors, but you also have to understand what these terms mean. So we've got a little
Yeah.
tool for that as well, which is nice.
Sure. And then do you want to quickly cover the founders market? Because I think that's really useful too for any stage of startup, really.
Yeah, yeah. We built that originally kind of as a little business model experiment. We thought, oh, could we put together all these products that founders need once after they raise capital? What do you need, right? You need accounting and recruiting and stuff like that, payroll. Could we consolidate all these things that you need as a founder into one place? And originally thought we'd get paid on some of these. It didn't really work out like that. But basically, it's a collection of like discounts on other products, stuff you need as you're building your startup, as you're growing your startup, as you're scaling up, even like office space. I think we have WeWork in there, stuff like that. I think there's about 25 or 30 deals in there. Most of it's stuff we use ourselves, Gusto and things like that.
Very cool. And let's talk about pricing quick because you basically can start for free. And then obviously for more features, you have to pay. But can you walk us through pricing?
Yep, there is a free version. It's free forever, does not require a credit card, but it is pretty limited. It lets you add up to 25 investors from the database, lets you do some searches. You can upload a pitch deck. You can create investor updates. It just doesn't have all the bells and whistles. The next tier up is 49 bucks a month, and then there's a $69 a month plan. And some of the bells and whistles, like you can integrate your email with those. So it pulls in email. You can send out decks and investor updates through the system. You can like do searches of the database and export your spreadsheet of investors. So there's just a lot of extra kind of premium features on that $69 a month plan. But that's basically it. There's no additional charge for extra users. So you can have multiple team members with you. And that's still 69 bucks a month for your company.
Sure. So I'm sure people are wondering, how do you actually get the investors into the system? Are you finding them? Are they applying a bit of both? Or what can people expect from that?
Yeah, it's it's a bit of a messy process. Sometimes I liken it to making sausage. It's not always the um, prettiest thing to watch, but hopefully it turns out all right in the end. A lot of it is, well, we kind of built it originally. We purchased some data sets. There was a private equity recruiter that was retiring. We bought his entire Rolodex from him. We have used some automated tools to gather like data from investors' websites and things like that, right? So we're kind of spidering and crawling sites and collecting data. We've had teams of MBA interns a couple times a year come in and manually upload and assemble data and add it to our database. And then we have a bunch of automated tools that help keep it clean, just like bounce, running the data set through, bounce detectors and stuff like that to keep it pretty up to date. But we're constantly adding to it, constantly cleaning it. Actually, I'll use this as a way to plug something we just added. We are now, when users come on and maybe they upload a spreadsheet, we do not take their investors and add them to our database. That's a common question.
Uh,
So we don't touch our users' data. However, we just launched a feature where we are now asking our users to add a little bit of data about these investors. If you just pitched um, Chicago Ventures or whatever, and maybe they gave you a term sheet, maybe they invested in you. We have like a few super short little tags and questions, little feedback that we're asking our users to contribute so that the next founder who wants to go pitch them will have a few notes or tips for that. So we're starting to gather some crowdsourced data on the investor database, which I'm pretty fired up about.
that's
And
awesome, actually. That's really
yeah,
helpful.
I really think it has a lot of powerful, founders are good about helping other founders. That's one of the reasons
Yeah.
I love working with entrepreneurs is just there's a camaraderie. And fundraising is scary and fundraising is stressful. And so if you can get a little bit of help from fellow
100%.
founders who've gone before you, why not, right? So
Totally. Yeah. Well, the reality is these documents are already getting shared between like people you know. So why not give them to other people that are looking to pitch as well, right?
yeah, totally.
So I'm curious about, you guys have a lot of really good content on your blog, and I think your most recent are the 15 questions venture capitalists will ask before investing in your startup. What's in store for venture capital in 2022. Can you maybe give us a little bit of an overview of those couple articles and some of the other stuff you cover on your blog? Because there's a lot of really useful, good content there as well.
Yeah. So if you want to check this out directly, it's blog.foundersuite.com. We also have a site up on Medium. I think it's medium.com/foundersuite. But where a lot of this stuff is coming from. So every year, I think this is kind of a cool little thing we do. Every New Year's, basically, we have a little tiny marketing team. We have a challenge to like come up with a new marketing experiment. All right. Doesn't matter
Okay.
what it is, the wilder the better. And I guess it's been 3 years now or so. 3 years ago, we had this idea of let's start a blog, or let's start a podcast.
Okay.
And, everyone's got a podcast, but whatever. This isn't like that original, but it was still something new for us. And the podcast has been doing pretty well. It's called How I
That's
Raised
awesome.
It, and it's interviews with founders. But what's cool about it is all that content that comes from the podcast, I'm sure you appreciate this too, can then be kind of repackaged into blog posts, into
Yeah.
guest articles, into Medium posts. And that's been really powerful, to kind of take, like we just put up not too long ago on the blog. I think it's the best fundraising advice of 2021 from interviews with like 40 different founders, right?
Yeah.
So one little article summarizes, I guess we did 40 interviews and we took the best from 21 different founders. And these are some really high profile founders. But you read that one article, you're basically getting the best of kind of like the Cliff's notes of 40 hours of podcasts in one article that will take you 10 minutes, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
the power of this whole model, is just to kind of take content, repackage it, summarize it, synthesize it into stuff that people can actually use. And that's how we're approaching it. So it's been fun.
But I actually think that's really good advice for startups listening, is if you do these podcasts, because you can repurpose that content in a blog post or what else, right? I think, just to reiterate, I think that's a really good marketing strategy, especially for SEO and getting your content out there, right? And you only have to record one thing and then write an article, and there's transcription tools, so you can just kind of a lot of it, the work is potentially done for you, or at least 50% with some of these automated tools.
Yeah. And frankly, we're probably not even tapping, we're like the iceberg, there's tip of the iceberg on this, because I feel like we could be carving these up into short clips. And I feel like there's
Right.
a ton of stuff we could be doing. I'd be curious if you have anything that's working really well for you with your content. Is there anything that like is just crushing it?
Yeah, I think my problem is just time to build some of this stuff. Like I'm in the same boat as you. I do like the tip of the iceberg type stuff, and I know I should be breaking my content into little clips, that are a few minutes long. I think having a trailer, something I got to get my acting gear on. Like,
Yeah.
I also think too, because the podcast market is so saturated, if you can get on like an FM station, your listenership will go way up.
Mm.
More
Mhm.
people are going back to traditional kind of, or even like a streaming station, because they know um, sometimes that might be helpful. And then I also like just doing little video interviews on a deeper dive on something. Sometimes if they're like 20-30 minutes, has helped me a lot too. So, and people love doing video,
Like
right?
that.
I think if you, so, um, yeah. So we talked a bit about the podcast. Can you reiterate what's the podcast called again, and what types of stuff do you cover?
Yeah. And it's called How I raised it, it's an homage. I like to think of it as an homage, not a copycat of how I built this, but from Guy Raz. But it's called How I Raised It, and really, it is kind of one dimensional. That sounds bad, but it is all about fundraising, right? That's
Right.
the theme and the topic, and we explore that in. But even though it's monotopical, it is very diverse in what we talk about. Like I just got off the phone, or just did one right before chatting with you, with a new venture fund based in Milwaukee called VC, and how they raised their fund and how they differentiate by doing like design sprints with their startups. Really just interesting stuff. Um, Before that, also this morning, I did an interview with um, a startup called Burnt that is making an NFT marketplace, and they raised all their capital from crypto firms on like Discord and stuff like that. So very non-traditional way of fundraising, but the topics are the same. We're covering everything from an
Right.
NFT marketplace to venture firm and everyone in between, and how they raise money, and all the really get into the weeds on like the tactics and the tips they employ to get people to write a check. That's basically what it's about.
Interesting, because yeah, sometimes fundraising can be such a black box, right? You have no idea, and then depending on the firms you're pitching, they all have different processes and sometimes even ways you need to do certain things. And it seems like the East Coast can be different than the West Coast, and the
Sure.
middle can be different, like between both, and it gets really confusing. Do you agree?
100%, 100%. I used to think that I knew everything about fundraising. I used to think there is one right way to do it. And I do still think there are some kind of core tenets about raising money, but I've learned from the podcast. We've done like 225 interviews with people who have raised capital, and I've learned that there's 225 different ways to do it. And it's so there's still not a one specific playbook, even though I think you can pick up tips and tactics from all these different people. Like, just an example, one of the ones we did maybe just 2 or 3 weeks ago was only focused on like how to run a VC meeting, both during the meeting and like the follow-up afterwards. Like really granular stuff. Like as a first-time founder, you're not gonna it's not rocket science, but you're not gonna intuitively know all this stuff. You know what I mean? So it's like
Sure.
just unpacking that stuff can be really, really valuable, right? Because you don't need to make the same mistakes that I made. You know?
Sure. So can you give us a couple examples of how to run a VC meeting? I selfishly, I want to know.
Yeah. Let me see if I can remember it from top of mind. I mean, his whole thing was he had like a 7-step process, and so I'm not
Okay.
gonna probably do it justice, but it was like, in the first 5 minutes or even 2 minutes, like, set an agenda for the rest of the meeting, um, and really making it very conversational and not like a script, and kinda tailoring it around, um, what the investor wanted to talk about, right? Um, yeah, and then, kind of like asking the investor a lot of questions, qualifying that investor. Um, he had a bunch of tips for like following up right away. Like one of his cool tips, which I have really never heard before, was if they are interested in pursuing further, you send them a data room and you say, this data room has all our information, all our pitch decks, all our customer references, all our information for you to make a decision, and you have access until uh March 2nd. So really creating like
Oh, interesting.
a process and a timeline, a deadline, frankly, for investors. Like, here it all is. Here's everything about our business that you need to make a decision. You have 3 weeks or whatever to go in, get what you need, and make a decision, right? Because I thought that was really clever and really different, and that was really cool, right? Because that's the hard part of it, getting investors to move at your time frame.
Yeah, well, and it also creates that sense of urgency. It sucks when you're raising money and you're waiting, you know, 2 months, 6 months for some of these deals to close or not close, right? And then I guess it's like they should be able to give you a reasonable answer, or at least a follow-up to say, look, we're not going to make this 3-week timeline. Can we have another 2 weeks, or whatever the number is, right?
Yeah.
But you're kind of moving them along instead of the other way. That's interesting. I've never heard that before, and I guess it's worth a shot, and it must work for some VCs. Interesting. One thing that I'm curious then to get your thoughts on, I've heard recently from a few investors, is record a quick, like 1 or 2 minute video of the founders just kind of quickly introducing themselves, maybe quickly talk about the product, just so they don't have to go do research on like who the founders are. They can just like quickly see a little video. You don't have to get, like, it doesn't have to be crazy professionally shot or anything. Like, the cameras on your computer are good enough, but to give kind of just like a quick little video. Have you heard that, or your thoughts around that? Because you've done this for a long time.
I don't dislike the idea. I think it could be kind of fun, especially if it's short, right? Investors are not going to sit through a 5-minute video. If it's a minute or two and provides a little personality and color. I think it's still hard to get investors to watch something like that. They want to like skim a deck on their iPhone. They want
Right.
to like,
Yeah. Okay.
there was some statistic, I think it might have come from Docs, and this might not be the exact number, but it was basically like on average, investors spend like, it was a low number, like a minute and a half on a pitch deck. It was a really low number. So if you could capture you and your personality and your firm's personality and maybe some exciting metrics in a minute or so, I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting. I just wouldn't be surprised if a lot of investors don't watch it. So I wouldn't like rely on it as your only
No, it's
strategy.
good.
Yeah.
So what other advice do you give to people looking to raise capital? Because again, you've done this a bunch of times and you've seen a ton of companies do this.
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot to the question, but I think some of the common things we're seeing, like, and this is something we're seeing with people on our podcast, kind of commonalities. I would say like roughly maybe 85% of them started building relationships with investors way in advance of raising capital. So, and this is surprising to people. They're like, okay, I
But
started
how do
this
you
startup.
do that?
Now it's, yeah. So a couple ways. So one is obviously if you're already working, maybe you don't have your startup launched yet, but you're working in a firm, start to get to know. We've had people on the show that were like working at a startup that was raising capital, and that person was maybe an engineer or designer, but they would, purposely plug themselves into the fundraising process to start to build networks with investors. Okay, but not everyone can do that, right? So
Sure.
another way to do that is, and this is one of my favorites. This is something we talk about on our funding hacks, which is a webinar we do, but like build a target list of investors, spend 50 plus hours building like the ultimate list of investors in your space. If you're in robotics, if you're in whatever it is, build the list of ultimate investors in that space. Get to know them online, follow them on Twitter, engage with them a little bit. And then once you've kind of built that list and identified not just funds, but people, reach out to them with what I call the permission email. And it basically says something like, hey, my name is Nathan. I'm working on this startup. It's in the fintech SaaS space. I know you've done a lot of deals in that space. I've been following you on Twitter for a while. Really impressed by some of your investments, whatever it may be. Flatter them a little bit. We're heads down mode right now. We haven't launched yet, but we send out a monthly 1-page summary update of our progress. Can I have your permission to add you to our distribution list? I think you're going to like what we're doing, right? Something like that. Can I give you early access or a sneak peek of what we're building here? And a lot of investors will be open to that because, hey, you're not asking them for money. You're not asking them even for time at this moment. You're not asking them to get on a Zoom at this moment. You're simply asking them, can you add them to your company update distribution list? But then as you send this out and they see your progress, put out a question to this group like, hey, can anyone, we're trying to recruit I'm just making this up, a robotics QA engineer. Can anyone recommend a good place to source this? You start to kind of engage this little community.
Interesting.
Maybe you set up here's where you start to talk about is a quick Zoom call to get their feedback on something with your top list, right? You start to engage them a little bit in what you're doing. And then, a couple months later, you mentioned, hey, we're going to be kicking off our seed round next month. This is all in the investor update you're sending. We're going to be kicking off our seed round next month. Let me know if you'd like me to send over our pitch deck or an early draft of our pitch deck, something like that. And so you kind of just involve them in your process at a really early age or really early stage without asking for very much, right? Because that's
Yeah.
often the problem. Yeah. So
No, I think that's actually really good advice because you're almost you're basic well, what's the running joke? It's like if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money.
sure. Yep.
So
Yep.
it's kind of that, right? Like no,
Well, that's right. And but you're right. You're showing them your progress. You're maybe asking for a little bit of advice here, but they're seeing that you're conscientious and maybe you're even taking some of the advice and putting it to work, right? I mean, that's really great, right? That makes everyone feel good. And so as the investor, that's the type of founder you want to put money into, is one that's
100%.
coachable, that's making progress, right? So there is something true to that. Now, flip that around and it's just this random founder who you've never heard of before coming straight at you saying, "We're raising 3 million bucks. Do you want in on the deal?" I've never heard of you before. I don't know anything about you. Maybe if you have like incredible traction or something, I'll still set up a call with you. But it's definitely like a very abrupt way to approach them. It's like going for marriage right on the first date kind of thing.
Yeah, no, fair. I think that's good advice. And it actually kind of goes back to your comment earlier about like the podcasting and like what's worked for me or not worked for me. And I'm just, like I said, just doing the tip of the iceberg. But what I've noticed is I've had investors on the show, a number of years ago, and I've never was raising capital at the time I had them on the show, but like they know who I am because
Yes.
of I can write back to them and say, you did my show 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And I get that, not if you start a podcast today, but there's a reason to reach out to an investor, say, hey, we're building this robotics company in this space. We're launching a podcast in a month or two about robotics. You guys invest in this space. Love to have you as a guest. You don't have to ask
Yes.
them some will say yes, some you'll never hear back from. Some will say, take a hike, but it doesn't matter. You start building that list. And there is majority of my guests I've had on the show, and there's over 500 shows now, that I would probably never talk to even 1% of those people if I didn't have the show.
Yeah. I love it. I think that's a great funding hack. I don't know if we had anyone directly employ that tactic, but I think that would be perfect, right? You're a robotics
Yeah.
startup, start a robotics podcast, interview every freaking investor in robotics space, and they're going to know of you. They might not invest in you because maybe they have a competing deal or they just don't like what you're doing, but they're going to know of you at least. And that's marketing 101, right? Building
Well,
brand awareness. Yeah.
and you never know where they're going to end up or you're going to end up. If you pivot, maybe they leave, go to another firm that's looking for, like, you don't know. And well, you've been in it long enough. Some people never change jobs, but majority of people change jobs every few years unless you're the owner or CEO, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah, totally.
I'm curious if there's any other advice that you'd give to startups looking to raise capital.
You know, yeah, there's a ton. I mean, I'm trying to think like the best couple. I think put yourselves in the shoes of investors, right? They are bombarded, hounded constantly from needy founders, hitting them up for money. Now, their job is to find the good startups, right? That's how
Right.
you make money as a VC, is finding the diamond in the patch of coal, or I don't know what the right metaphor is there, but finding
Yeah.
the good ones in a noisy sea of startups. So just think of that from that perspective. You've got to be, and that means a few things. It means your pitch materials need to be really crisp and polished because you're competing with 30 other deals they saw that week, right? It
Right.
means if you can get a warm intro to them, that notches you up a level, right? It's like that can help set you apart from the noise. If you can build some of this external brand, like we just talked about, maybe it's a podcast, maybe you are speaking at certain events. You know, if you can get yourself on stage at robotics conference, you know,
Yeah.
and that's great. That's huge because there's sort of building that again, branding and awareness of you, not only to your customers but investors. That's great. Um, and you know, just making yourself kind of something that is going to be attractive to investors. That can also mean traction and progress, of course, right? The worst startup is one that, and we see these sometimes. They're like, Nathan, I have this great idea for a robotic startup, but to do anything, I need to raise 2 million bucks. Like, I need the money to, you know, if I had money, then I could do this. Well, that's automatic like failure mindset, right? Because
Yeah.
that's just not how founders work. Founders make it happen one way or another, whether it's moonlighting, whether it's keeping their day job and funneling their paychecks into building a proof of concept robotic arm, whatever it may be, right? You make it happen. And you know, as investors want to see these founders that can overcome any obstacle and bust through walls to make their dream happen. So I would say just kind of put yourself in the mind of investors. If you were investing in a startup, what kind of founder would you want to see? Someone who's dynamic, who's driven, who's going to bust through those walls, who's polished in their pitch and presentation and materials, and who just has that kind of it factor. I know it's pretty generic, but you know it when you see it. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And you're right. It is very much about just going for it and figuring it out and struggling through it. And they want to see that. Investors want to see that. And I've heard a bunch of investors say that they're fine with the failures and the pivots. And in some
Yeah.
cases, a lot of them will only invest in people that have failed before because they know that person will keep picking themselves up and keep going when times get tough, right?
Yep.
And times
Absolutely.
will get tough. Like multiple times throughout the day sometimes will get tough.
Yeah.
Never mind a week, right? Like I always joke it's the best and worst thing I've ever done, and I'll give you one of those two answers depending on the 15-minute interval I'm in at the time.
Right.
So, you know, it's pretty bad some days, but I couldn't think of doing anything else at the same time, right?
Yesterday, we're recording this on a Tuesday. Yesterday morning, Monday morning,
Okay.
I'm logging on and there's some Redis issue and our site crashes.
Okay. Okay.
And another guy is having some issue, and I don't think it's actually on our fault, but he sent a pitch deck to investors and somehow it's sending like 5 copies of it to investors. And again, I think it's his email, not anything on us. I've never heard of this happen before, but
Right.
like he's trying to communicate with investors and they're just getting like 5 decks from him. And then I've got engineers in Ukraine and you know Putin is threatening to invade Ukraine and there's chatter
Right.
that they're going to cut off the internet. So I'm thinking, all right, the site is crashing. These terrible things are happening to our users and our Ukrainian engineers are about to be cut off from civilization. Like that's a Monday morning.
Yeah.
And then, you know, 20 minutes later, a bunch of new customers sign up and I'm happy again. But I mean, that's a day in the life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you actually shared that because you've been doing this a long time and stuff like this still happens to everyone. It doesn't matter whether it's day one or day, 7,000 or whatever. It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. To be very clear, our site does not crash very often. It's been down like 2 minutes in the last couple of years. But still,
Sure.
it
Oh,
happens.
it
It
happens to
happens.
everybody, right? Like,
Yeah,
well, every time Amazon servers go down, like half the internet goes down, or same with
that's
the
right.
Google servers, right? It's like everybody uses these technologies, and one of those big players goes down, everybody goes down, right? So just
Yep.
it is
Yep.
what it is. Well, but we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, Foundersuite, the podcast, and any other links you want to mention?
Sure. Yeah. If you are raising capital or thinking about it, I'd love to put in the plug. Just check out foundersuite.com, foundersuite.com. Like we mentioned earlier, there's a free version. You can check it out, poke around a bit, and then it's not too expensive if you upgrade, $49 or $69. Also the blog.foundersuite.com, lots of good stuff there. And then if you just search on How I Raised It on Spotify, iTunes, we also have a good YouTube channel. Search on Foundersuite or How I Raised It will show up. And then just the usual suspects like Twitter at foundersuite.com. I'm happy to connect with people. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Actually, I'll plug that for a second. On LinkedIn, we put out a lot of 2 or 3 things a week, very active creating content on LinkedIn. And a lot of it's like, list of medical tech investors, or here are top 20 questions that VCs are going to ask you, like pretty tactical, valuable stuff on LinkedIn, and happy to connect with you. Maybe just mention you heard about it on Building the Future show, or friend of Kevin or whatever. Happy to connect on LinkedIn, and that's pretty much it.
Perfect, man. Well, I really appreciate you again taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. I appreciate it so much. Have a good rest of your day too. And thanks for the airtime.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com, and keep building the future.